Why do you think she named her daughter Tamar? I mean, Tamar is found in the book of Genesis, obviously, and while she is a direct ancestor of our Lord, she also resorted to prostitution and trickery to bear the son from whom Jesus would descend. So, do we know what was behind her naming her daughter Tamar?
No, at least I don't. It's a really good question. I wondered too, the interest in the name. She wrote a serialized novel called What Price Love back
Okay.
before the conversion. That I guess back in the day, newspapers had these novels a lot of times where they would, every day a new installation, of the novel, and it's a romance. One of our interns liked it. Um, I didn't get too much into it, but they're each like there are these newspaper articles that each are an installment, and the main character is named Tamar. And I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. So I wondered if she might have been thinking about that, both the biblical, but also if there's some other reason she liked it because she gave it to the character. But no one's ever explained this to me perfectly. But it's a good question.
Okay, very good. One thing is that she went out to Los Angeles, Hollywood, to write for Pathé Films,
Yeah.
and the depression hits. She loses her contract with the movie studio, and that's when she started getting, it seems, from what I've read, more involved with Catholic social activism. What was it about that time that inspired her to do that? I mean, did it have anything to do with her experiences in Los Angeles, or was it more just because the depression's going on and this sort of thing?
Well, it was Peter Morin. It was meeting Peter Morin and him talking to her about having building a movement together. That was the real change. Before that, she was following some activist movements for the Catholic press in that identity of, okay, maybe I can be a journalist for the Catholic press,
Right.
and kind of following up on that. But yeah, nothing about LA. I mean, LA was a great disappointment. When she got there, she found it to be pretty empty and not the kind of writing she wanted to do. So it probably would have ended eventually, but it was interesting. She was one of the last to be laid off, so she must have had some knack for it.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see if we could find any films that are still around, still exist,
Yeah,
where she was a screenwriter. She once had a lot of friends in the American Communist movement, as you've
yeah.
alluded to and discussed, but she later came to reject communism, didn't she?
Oh yeah, and there's in her early period, there's all kinds of articles you can read that are at the Marquette archives, and even in New York because they were New York papers. Queen's Work, that was a Jesuit newspaper that was dedicated to Mary. That's the Queen part of it, Queen's Work, and they ran an article by Dorothy where it was like ex-communist describes tools of the communists. So it was like someone who was an insider sharing what the commies really do. So it was a little sensational, but it was very practical too, because she was saying, look, this is what communists are doing, and unless we as a church come up with our response, they're going to succeed at it. She was saying, like, working people who are suffering the challenges of the depression need the church to help. And if the church doesn't, the communists are going to step in. And this was the same rationale behind Pope Leo the 13th's Rerum Novarum, like 40 years prior to that, of, hey, the commies are going to get them unless the church is there with something better. And it's in our teaching. So let's do something. And
Well,
so
it's
that
interesting because
she had this
another
whole series of articles like that, which were like, ex-communist tells you like it is.
Well, it's interesting because there's another convert, an Englishman named Douglas Hyde, who wrote a whole book about this. And both he, excuse me, and Venerable Fulton Sheen were saying kind of the same thing,
Mm.
which is as what she is in this respect, which is very interesting. Now, when it comes to World War II, you know, what most people know about her is that she was indeed a pacifist. She didn't think we should be going to war with Nazi Germany or with Japan or any of it. And yet, her brother, her older brother by 2 years, so I guess her most immediate sibling, was a Nazi supporter. He was doing radio broadcasts for the Germans during at least 1944 and 1945. And it was largely because he was, it seems like that he may have been a little anti-Semitic, but mostly it was because he was an anti-Bolshevik. He was an anti-communist, and very fervently so. Do you know if the two of them ever discussed this topic?
That's a great question. That's really an area that is unexamined by the cause at this point. Um, but yeah, that's really important. I know that there were plenty of tensions with them, over the years around politics. But that's an interesting one. I did hear that she had provided some help in his later years. I think he had a lot of problems in his last years, and she helped him out. But that's a really good question about his sympathies, sort of Nazi sympathies. What you would have done with that? I mean, they did not have big Thanksgiving dinners where the whole day family came back together, so there would be none of that awkwardness. But that is, I have not seen anything in the diaries or anything in the letters about it. It doesn't seem to be something she's writing much about.
How does she explain her conversion to her communist friends?
Well, that's a great question, and the book From Union Square to Rome was the point of that book. She began it with there was letter to an agnostic. She had these letters to an agnostic that were published in a small Catholic publication. Actually, it was published out of Alabama, and that became the prototype for From Union Square to Rome, which was to try to explain, because like a lot of converts, she wanted to bring everyone else along with her.
Right.
So she wanted to tell her story and say, hey, there's this beautiful life for you over here. So yeah, From Union Square to Rome is really that argument.
You know, my wife's going to hate you, Jeffrey, because you're driving me to all these books now that I want to get and read. And I already have so many, as you can see from behind me, that I haven't even ever touched. Let's getting back to this situation of her pacifism, not only with the civil defense drills, which you mentioned, for which she was arrested for non-participation, but also World War II. She was a faithful Catholic in so many ways that would surprise many of the people who lionize her. And yet she dissented from just war theory. Do you think was it because she thought she knew better than the church on this matter that she said, no, the church is wrong in this? Or was she not saying that exact? I mean, talk a little bit about that, please.
Well, I think she is back to the primacy of Scripture. I mean, I don't think it was fathomable for her that blessed are the peacemakers meant except in the following circumstances. That she really, felt that strongly. And what's interesting about, your question about the church, because that was not the church teaching when she was saying it, that after Vatican II, it became an option in church teaching. So there's a respect for and a place for her position in Catholic teaching that wasn't there when she started. So, some people say the church has caught up to her. And there's another, and that's in saying that this is an option. The question of, is this the teaching for everyone, is one that, some people are saying that the conditions required for just war have become so difficult that we are moving as a church into more of a pacifist position, which is not the teaching right now, but it is something that's being debated, because when you think about weapons of mass destruction and collateral damage and so forth, you know, is it possible for us to conduct war in a way that is consistent with just war doctrine? That's a question some people are debating. And if we got to that point of pacifism, it would be, again, more like Dorothy than beginning. So she wasn't afraid to dissent, but as a faithful dissenter. You know, she's saying, you know, we need to be more faithful to the gospel. She's not saying, oh, we need to bring in this other teaching from some other source. She's saying we need to be more faithful to the gospel. And ultimately, the church did catch up to her. And then there were times in which she called out church leaders. Most of the time, she was actually very, very encouraging to bishops and publicly thanking them, lionizing them, and so forth. But she did call out Cardinal Spellman on the gravedigger strike of 1949, where
Right.
the cardinal believed, you know, the guys, gravediggers, were asking for a 5-day work week. That's something, huh? 5-day work week. They were asking for a 5-day
Unheard
work
of.
for the same weekly wage. And he said, no way. And by the way, your union's full of communists. I'm not even going to deal with your union anymore. And
Wow.
so they went on strike. And she told the cardinal, look, you know, you need to respond to Catholic teaching and, you know, and the gospel, and really respond to these workers by giving them a fair wage and a fair work week. And that went on for a while. And finally, they got too many bodies piling up. You know, it was
Really?
a situation with just too many bodies piling up. So he said, you know what? We're going to have our seminarians go in there and dig the graves, which basically scabs. They made the seminarians. And a colleague of mine at the Archdiocese of New York actually met one of these priests who had been a seminarian who had to dig the graves. This is, you know, a long time ago. And he said the seminarians just hated it, but they didn't hate it because of the workers. They hated it because it was the middle of winter and they were digging graves.
Oh, miserable. You know, we're talking about a little bit about how her stance on pacifism during World War II caused her to lose some support amongst Catholics. But that wasn't the first time. The first time, it seems, unless there's another you can inform us, is her position on the Spanish Civil War, which featured the pro-Catholic, pro-church forces of Francisco Franco against the communist and radical Republicans. And, you know, who were going out, you know, if you look in the month of August, day after day after day, and even into this time of the year, but mostly in August of 1936, it's when hundreds and thousands of priests and seminarians and religious and just average lay people, husbands and wives, children even, were killed because of their Catholic faith. And she refused to take a side, because even in the face of just tremendous support for the Republican or for the Franco forces, because of her pacifist views, and that lost her a lot of support. The Catholic workers' circulation dropped from 150,000 to just 30,000. Does she understand the drop in support, or was she bewildered by it?
Probably a little of both. I think she understood it, but also felt that they had to take that stand of neutrality. And I think it was, you know, what a lot of people look at now in histories of World War II say that the Spanish Civil War is the opening act of World War II.
Right.
And so when you look at Dorothy's, you know, position after Pearl Harbor, you know, opposing military force, it's connected to the other one. You know, it's all connected. And she, in that opposition to Spanish Civil War, she was certainly, you know, you read the articles and she says, we're the only Catholic organization that's doing this. And they did get kicked out of the Catholic Press Association for a while.
Really?
Too. Yeah. So, I mean, there was like kind of a censure by their colleague papers about this, that how can you be doing this? So it is, you're right, that is the first time, but it is also part of the World War II drop off.
So we're back with, after a few technical difficulties, which are always a lot of fun. But we've overcome those, adapt, improvise, and overcome, as they taught me in the Army. And that's, and now we're back with the discussion. Jeffrey, we were talking about her civil disobedience during the 50s with respect to civil defense drills and things like this. And so we're now at the beginning of the 60s in her life, but I'd like to, so I'd like to discuss what happened with the 60s through the 70s up to her death in 1980. But before we do that, so just so we don't forget, I'd like to talk about her relationship a little bit with someone who is famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, and that is Margaret Sanger, founder of the of Planned Parenthood, but also the eugenics movement in this country, had influenced Hitler and some others in that respect because of her reviews and her promotion of the eugenics movement. And Dorothy, you know, before we began our discussion for the first part, you and I had been talking a little bit about this book. And by the way, folks, if you want a fantastic read, one that is really compelling, I would suggest this. Now, I'm not very far into it, as you can see, but what I can tell you is that it is just fascinating reading. And Jeffrey, on page 2, where the letters start, her very first letter is to Margaret Sanger. And she writes, "I am sorry the League does not feel that it can afford," and that's the, what is the League for, the American League?
Birth Control, American League for Birth Control.
Okay, great. So I am sorry the League does not feel that it can afford a publicity director, as I am so interested in the work. I should have liked the job, but it is probably better for me that I'm not going to get it, for it would take all my time and I need some more hours a day for my writing and proofreading on my books. So here it is, she's talking, and then she goes on to talk about how she and her sister Della will pay a call to Margaret at her hotel. And Della, her sister, was very, very intimately involved with Margaret Sanger and her work, had worked for Margaret Sanger as an employee. And so, you know, there was this relationship there. But then at the very end of her life, Dorothy's writing, and she writes this: "One difference of opinion between my sister and me came strongly to my mind a few nights ago as I watched on television the story of Margaret Sanger. When our family moved from Chicago to New York, my sister, who had chosen to study shorthand and typing, went to work for this crusading woman and herself became a rabid, if I can use such a sharp word for a beloved sister, or possible of spreading the message of birth control information." Later on, she says that Della exhorted me on another occasion that I should not urge, as a Catholic, Tamar, my daughter, to have so many children. Tamar had 9 children. And to have so many children, I got up firmly and walked out of the house, whereupon she ran after me weeping, saying, don't leave me, we just won't talk about it again." So our friendship continued, and I had many a happy visit with her over all these years, and I shall surely miss her. She's writing this obviously on the occasion of Della's death. So what do we know about do we know anything really more about this, or than about the relationship between Margaret Sanger and Dorothy Day?
Well, I think some of this takes us back to Dorothy's suffrage work, where I think she was, when she was arrested, among the other people being arrested was Margaret Sanger's sister.
Oh, okay.
And these women all went on hunger strike together. And, Dorothy had some miserable times, depressed times. She turned to the Psalms. This is before her conversion, but she read the Psalms in prison to comfort herself. And Margaret Sanger's sister, I think her name was Ethel, she almost died. And Margaret Sanger made her promise. Part of the deal to pardon the women was that they'd go off their hunger strike. And afterwards, Margaret Sanger made her sister promise to leave public life, leave Planned Parenthood, and stay out of these kinds of protests for her health. And in the process, was kind of written out of the history of Planned Parenthood. If you go back and look at how it's written today, it's all Margaret Sanger, but really it was her and her sister. So there's a little strangeness there. But the Dorothy's role in it, there's some folks who have argued that she covered in the radical press in some unsigned articles Ethel's struggle, because it was certainly, she almost died, so it was considered heroic from that side's point of view. So I think the connection with Margaret Sanger was really probably more with her sister, and then applying with Margaret Sanger's sister, and then trying to get a job. In those days, it was very much part of the progressive, radical, socialist, anarchist movements around birth control. So it was a natural step for her at the time. One that later, that wasn't her position, but at the time that she wrote Margaret Sanger, she very much wanted to work in that movement.
Interesting. Now, we've kind of covered the first half of her life. Let's move into the 60s and the 70s, where you had the issues with Vietnam. The Catholic worker is growing, or the houses of hospitality, rather. And, her relationship to the counterculture. I think that there's a great quote that she has, something about, I did everything they're doing except for the drugs. So tell us a bit, now that we've, the civil defense, as you noted just a little bit ago, the civil defense drills, they've stopped. They stop in around 1961. And now what does her public life look like?
Right. And I think when we look at Dorothy's relationship to the counterculture, or to hippies, or whatever you want to call that era, it begins in the 50s with the Beats. That people like Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and that crowd, Dorothy had no patience for them, because she felt like it was just all about, wow. It was all about hedonistic gratification. You could see this in her diaries. She does knock the Beats many times, but she did really respect Allen Ginsberg as an artist, as a poet, and actually developed a friendship with him. Kind of, like Dorothy had this, criticize the movements that are problematic and the institutions that are problematic, but make friends with the people. And she was, reasonably decent friends with Allen Ginsberg. And there is one letter in that letter collection, which you should make sure you acquaint yourself with. It's very interesting, because Allen Ginsberg, his partner, had a developmentally disabled brother. And he asked if Dorothy could take care of the brother. And Dorothy's response was very interesting. A little bit of the, like when Jesus challenges the rich young man and other people who, she seems to be harder on Allen Ginsberg than she is on a lot of people. She says, his brother is Christ. You need to take care of him as you would Christ if he were in front of you. So she really gave Allen Ginsberg a challenge there. And I don't know, that probably is a matter of, Ginsberg scholar could answer that question, what ended up happening. But Dorothy really kind of gave him some tough love there, saying, you all need to take care of the brother.
That's wonderful. It's and it's a challenge that all of us need to make. It's so easy to see the mote in our brother's eye than it is the beam that's sticking out of our own. And I think what you just shared kind of speaks to that. So, the early 60s, it's the advent of we're still in the advent of the nuclear age. President Kennedy has just been assassinated. President Johnson comes to the fore, and he starts the Great War on Poverty. And what is it that we know about her, and of course, the burgeoning war in Indochina, in Vietnam. So
Yeah.
we know about her, and these are tumultuous times for America, arguably the most consequential decade in American history, because so much changes during this decade in so many different ways, not only with respect to civil rights and expanding government welfare services and this sort of thing, but our attitudes towards war, our attitudes towards executive power in the presidency, attitudes towards Congress, so much starts to change at least in the 60s. So tell us a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, Dorothy in the 60s. It's so interesting how, I just answered the last question, but really you have to look to the 50s. With the Vietnam War, it's the same thing. The Catholic Worker has articles questioning U.S. involvement in Vietnam in the 50s. That there were, that there were little things that were happening that she and the other editors, it hit some red flags for them. So we see a concern about Indochina as it's written up as early as the 1950s. And then, of course, that becomes the Vietnam War, and many Catholic workers are very much involved. And there's a lot of different Catholic and other Christian peace movements that come into the fore. So for Dorothy, part of it was working with the Catholic workers who were protesting the Vietnam War. There's the famous draft card burning. Tom Cornell was part of that. That is a significant part of American history of that time. And then you also have, there was an incident of a mentally ill person who doused himself with gasoline and immolated himself to protest the Vietnam War in the use of napalm. And he said he was a Catholic worker. And he definitely had been hanging out at the house, but it wasn't like he was someone who was integral. He had a lot of, emotional problems. And, you kind of see this as in part of expression of it, or it's an expression of a desire for peace that that takes a very ugly and problematic turn. And so when people saw that he had written that he was a Catholic worker, Dorothy came under criticism as if she had helped to plan it. And so that was a very dark time. Even Thomas Merton kind of turned on her for a time until she explained. Yeah, because Thomas Merton, just like Dorothy had no patience for the Beats, Thomas Merton probably would have a lot of sympathy for, John Lennon's song Revolution, with the Beatles, that, when you talk about destruction, that's when you know that you can count me out, that he was, okay. Merton was sympathetic to the counterculture, but when it came time to setting yourself on fire in a public place, he had no interest in that at all. And neither did Dorothy. So Dorothy clarified that. And so there was a lot of things happening in the peace movement where, different factions wanted to take different strategies. The whole idea of, burning draft cards, damaging federal property, those kinds of things were debated very much in the peace movement. And they weren't part of Dorothy's strategies herself, but it was a very chaotic time, and there would be people who would be part of different movements at the same time, and then they would do something and it would come under criticism. So that's sort of part of it. But the thing I wanted to really emphasize was, this was a movement that often it was said, don't trust anyone under 30. And here we have
Bob Dylan,
this grandmother, we have this grandmother who suddenly has become this mentor for all of these people under 30. And so it was a very interesting thing. And it was, one in which she enjoyed the mentoring, but she did not enjoy she never complained about rock and roll, but definitely the sex and drugs were problematic for her. She really thought it was leading people down the wrong road. And she had had her own experience with, too much drinking and love affairs, jumping into bed too quickly and then really feeling, like, oh, this is, blowing up. We talked about Lionel at length last time. So she felt like that there needed to be kind of some moral boundaries around the movements. As much as she was sympathetic towards the critique of the culture, the critique of money and possessions and so forth that the hippie counterculture had. I mean, she had that too, but she wasn't by any means interested in the drugs.
What's interested me, I read an article not long ago that said she was more like John Paul II than Gloria Steinem when it came to the free love movement during the 1960s in the counterculture. And when you read the quote which is associated with which accompanies that observation, you kind of shake your head and think, yeah, that makes perfect sense that someone would say this. Let's take just a brief step back and the election of John Kennedy. Now, before then, before Kennedy's election, Catholicism is pretty much still a ghetto religion. West Virginia, for instance, never voted for a Republican candidate. By and large, after the Civil War, until the election that put Calvin Coolidge in the White House. And the reason is that his opponent, Al Smith, mayor of New York, was a Catholic. It wasn't because he had this huge nose and they didn't like his looks. He resoundingly lost the South, the Bible Belt South. And Catholics were their relationship to patriotism was seen as suspect because it was seen that they were beholden to a foreign power. So, for instance, the foreign power in this case being the Pope in Rome, and that is when you see foreign power very often from the Revolution till around the 50s, and that being suspect, very often they're talking about Catholics' allegiance to the Pope and having to follow what the Pope made the morals. So, here's Kennedy, and Kennedy has to go and make a speech to a convention of Baptists in Houston to show that he's his own man. It's a very famous speech. People should go read it if they haven't, and it's not too long. But now here's Dorothy, a Catholic convert. What is her attitude towards a Catholic being in the White House? Was she for Kennedy as a result of this, or was she's a woman who didn't vote, so maybe she didn't care? I don't know. You tell us.
Yeah, you kind of take us back to that conversation about her anarchism and her lack of interest in electoral politics. When you say, was she interested in Kennedy as a Catholic president? Probably the president part she had less interest in. She was more, she wrote in her diary a couple of times about him, during the campaign or his rise, where it's, vaguely positive stuff, but she doesn't really believe so much in electoral politics. So she doesn't really get that much into it. I think she's hoping for the best, but also, you might call it cautiously optimistic. I don't think she ever was as in love with Kennedy as people of that generation were.
Okay, well, that makes sense then, because, when you think about her views on the political process and the fact that she herself never once voted.
Well, you also come back to her role, which I think, and probably others have argued for or against this, but her role as a prophet, as an American prophet. A prophet doesn't just try to find the right candidate. A prophet always lifts up God's vision and points out how society is not has strayed from God's ways and chose the way back. That's what a prophet does, and that's what she continued to do during the Kennedy administration. So I don't think it's a matter of, how do we find the right candidate? A Catholic who truly believes in the teachings of the church and the Beatitudes and so forth. I don't think that was ever an aim of hers.
I see. Very good. So it's ipso facto kind of taken as read that she is going to oppose the war in Vietnam because she's opposed every other conflict, even the most just war of all, World War II, which I happen to agree with, but certainly wasn't her view. And so, and correct me if I'm wrong, but did her view on the Vietnam War develop any? I mean, did it become more stringent? Did it become a little? What was her? Tell us if there were any developments there.
Well, yeah, and the developments aren't really in her position as much as her relationship to it, because she was always critical. I mean, from the beginning of the advisors being in there, she was always critical of U.S. involvement in, originally they called it Indochina. She was always critical, but then her grandson went into the armed services and went to Vietnam. So, I don't know enough about her internal thinking about this, but everything I've read shows that she was always very generous to Eric Hennessy, her grandson. She was always very generous to him and cared a lot about him and kept up with him and would write about what he's doing in the Catholic Worker in a way that any proud grandmother would. But she did strongly oppose the war and preferred that he wasn't there at all. But they had their lives to live too and had their choices to make. I mean, I've heard that one of the Hennessy family told me that they used to have hunting trophies in their house in Vermont, Tamar's house. And I grew up in Louisiana. I get that. People in rural areas, they hunt, and many of them for food and supplemented diets and whatnot. And in Vermont, that's one of the things you do when you live in rural Vermont is you hunt. And so these guys had their trophies up on the wall, and Dorothy would stay in that guest room, and she politely asked them to take them down, not to destroy them, not it was wrong for them, but just, when she was there, could they just put them somewhere else? And
sure, I get that. I mean, if you get that 30-point buck, you want to show that you got that 30-point buck. I mean, that's a big deal. I used to live in Wisconsin. That would have been the thing. If someone got an 8-pointer, oh, wow, I got an 8-point buck. So I get them wanting to put that up on the wall, but I also understand, hey, this makes me a little uncomfortable. Let's kind of do something else maybe while I'm here. So that's fantastic. I really love that. One thing that would still make her polarizing even today is the fact that she lauded and it seems like she couldn't quite bring herself to say anything negative per se about, or at least roundly condemn people like Marx, Lenin, Mao, Castro, Ho Chi Minh. And we need to make the point that Stalinism, Stalinist Russia, that's a different thing. There's a telegram I read that she exchanged, I think in the late 20s, with people from the People's Workers' Party or the Communist Party, the Daily Worker, the editors at the Daily Worker, with her as editor of the Catholic Worker, saying, let's put down fascism and lack of freedom of religion and things like this. They're speaking of people being persecuted for being atheists. And she says, yeah, let's do that. And then let's also do this. And she just goes down. So she obviously has no truck with Stalinist. She has no part in Stalinist Russia. But people like Marx and Lenin and Mao and Castro, etc., she kind of even lionizes them and can't quite bring herself to condemn them. So why do you think that was? Was it
Well,
strong
that
today as we
probably,
have now, or what?
I think that I don't think lionize is the right word. I think she focused in her writings about, say, Castro. You know, that's we kind of have the most. I've never seen anything she wrote about Mao at all. She may have written something. I know she at some point must have written about communist China, but I've never seen anything about that. I know she was critical of Stalin, you know, once it was known, you know, what was really going on. With Castro, that's one that comes up a lot with the folks that are concerned about her as a candidate for sainthood. And we've gone over the material again and again, and what we see is a kind of a critique of the system that Castro was fighting against. And then she does go a little gentle on him, but I think it's more to balance what was in the US media at the time. I don't think she's a big fan of him as much as saying there's more to the story here. You know, she's a journalist, and she's in her way trying to make sure that there's a recognition that the system before was bad, really bad, and he led a revolution against that, and that there may be things that we want to change there, but it's not the kind of demonization that you were seeing in the country, and maybe that kind of raised a lot of eyebrows. It's almost like the Spanish-American War again. You know, here you have somebody. Remember, she got kicked out of the Catholic Press Association, so she was not a communist, but she did share the critique of communism that you find, I mean, the critique of capitalism that you find in Catholic social teaching. So I think sometimes people conflate the two. When people talk about her lionizing Castro, I always ask, well, could you give an example? And whenever the examples are given, they're not lionizing, but they're not criticizing. And people want her to criticize him at that time, but there's plenty of people criticizing Castro at that time.
You make a great point, and you know, there's and I'm impressed with what you're saying. The you know, I think this is also a good time to make the point that saints are not perfect. They don't come fully formed as saints out of their mother's womb, as Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, came fully formed out of the forehead of Zeus. You know, they had experiences, they had formations. They weren't infallible or omniscient. So to expect someone to have the right attitude on everything, or to have never made a misstep in their life, ignores what it is to be a saint. And that is someone who became further and further yoked to the person of Jesus Christ, so that eventually they put off the old man and put on the new man in Christ. You know, one thing's about Mother Teresa's, what I find to be at least somewhat troubling comments on, you know, good Hindu just needs to be a good Hindu, and a good Muslim a good Muslim. Well, no, you know, to me it's like they need to become a good Christian. Or Blessed Charlemagne, who is counted as a beato in the church, but who had several concubines, I mean, at least 9 or something, several wives, I think 3 or 4, and many legitimate children from mistresses to boot. And, you know, he also slaughtered thousands of Saxons because they feigned baptism. So, you know, to dismiss her out of hand as because, you know, because of a judgment on this or that particular little thing seems to really miss the point. And you just made a really interesting statement. She wasn't a communist. She also wasn't a socialist either, was she?
Well, it depends on what part of her life. And I think we need to also look into the whole idea of, you know, being perfect and everything. She lived into her 80s. So she went through different periods. Like, for example, in spirituality, in the 40s, one reason that some people left the Catholic worker was not World War II. It was these retreats that were happening, that Father Hugo from Pittsburgh, I don't know if that's a name that you recognize, but
No.
he had a whole theology that had its adherents among Catholics, which reminds me a little bit from my interfaith work of kind of almost like the dark side of Quakers, of
Really?
kind of like not enjoying anything of this world, like any pleasure you get is actually distracting you from Jesus Christ. Where I think the Catholic view was always, God put sugar on this earth for us to enjoy it, so that giving it up is not really bringing you closer to God, or, those kinds of things where,
Right.
in the Catholic Church, it's all about having a balance, between,
Exactly.
asceticism and hedonism, what's that balance, and enjoying what God has given us. So there's this period that she goes in where she's just very, very severe. And then she comes out of that. And, by the 70s, there's this great story of a Catholic worker who basically was kind of adopted that kind of spirituality. And Dorothy asked her to come out for coffee. And she got a big piece of cake and just, dramatically enjoyed it in front of this person. And they said that she was never a problem again with that. So, yeah, the whole question of, are saints perfect? Of course they're not. But also, how do they evolve? And do they kind of repudiate some of their early beliefs? Like Dorothy obviously, repudiated the communism, the socialism, and she kind of embraced Ammon Hennessy gave her the words to call it Catholic anarchism. That there's a Christian anarchism, that there's a kind of a focus on God and not government, that is a kind of anarchism. So these words, like their understanding of them evolve, and her attitude towards Catholic workers who did this or that, divorced and remarried, like in the 70s, she was, talking to those people. In the 50s, she was cutting them off, which was the right thing to do. What would a saint do? If you take a saint in one part of their life, maybe they're going in one direction, and another part of their life another. So that I just wanted to add that in, that
Okay.
that's a part of the story too, an evolution of her spirituality.
Well, she came eventually, at least, to favor not capitalism, not socialism, but something that was seen by, and still is seen by many as a middle way, called distributism. It was championed by people such as G.K. Chesterton and the great early 20th century writer Hilaire Belloc, or Beloche if you prefer. But in any event, it's where the rights of private property, they're a fundamental gift. The means of production should be spread out as much as possible. A lot of emphasis or lionizing, favoring of kind of cottage industries as opposed to big corporate concerns. How did she come to see that was really the more, in her opinion, perfect way to manage an economy?
That's a great question. I think it was reading those distributists. It was kind of a movement within the movement. There were a lot of Catholic workers that were talking about it, because the evidence, the evidence by then, I mean, during the 30s when capitalism collapsed, that's not really the time to talk about a better kind of capitalism. But by the 50s, things had come back. It was pretty clear that, capitalism is pretty good at bringing people out of poverty. But the problem is not enough people get to enjoy in it, because you have these, robber barons and, today multi-billionaires at the same time that you still do have poverty. So we have to find out ways of people being able to share in that wealth that capitalism produces. So I think within the Catholic worker, there were a lot of people studying the distributists and talking about them in the Friday night clarification of thought sessions that they had. So for Dorothy, things like the farms beginning to have cottage industries too was a good idea, a distributist idea, but it also was one in keeping with the monastic tradition too, that our monasteries supported each other with those cottage industries. Some people sold books, that kind of thing, small presses. And today, we have descendants of that. We have the Catholic Church supports the development of worker-owned businesses, supports the development of land trusts, where a nonprofit organization might own the land, but people own the house that gets built there. So they become a homeowner in places where maybe the land is so expensive they couldn't otherwise. So these are all distributist ideas that have kind of made itself into the kinds of social charities that the church supports.
And from, in my reading of the church's social works, the encyclicals and other documents, it seems, as I read them, where the church is saying, gosh, we should have this. We should have employee ownership of companies. We should have, profit sharing. And I think, well, that's kind of sounds like the American system. But you understand that when people like Pope Francis, who comes from, what are they, a crony capitalist society, I've read is what Argentina is, and probably a lot of economies down in South America and elsewhere around the world, you can understand why the perception that justice hasn't quite come, and the poor you will always have with you, and likely isn't to come this side of heaven, but that we can keep working for that justice, for that better way for all people. I live in West Virginia, and you drive down the road and you're out in the middle of God's great creation. It's beautiful beyond belief. And the next thing you know, you're seeing this gorgeous, gorgeous house. Whereas then you go around another bend and you see this house, and it's just completely decrepit. It's probably a mobile home or something. And the sides are falling off of it. Some of the windows have holes in them. And you think, gosh, I wonder how long it's been since someone lived there. And then you see a car that's fairly late model parked in the driveway. And you realize someone still lives there. So there's a lot of work to be done in that respect, certainly.
You also find the exact same statements in the teachings of St. John Paul II regarding capitalism. I mean, once the Cold War was over, he kind of turned his sights on capitalism in a way that probably, I mean, if you would take statements from Pope John Paul II's writings, encyclicals, and mix them in with Pope Francis's, and ask people to identify which pope said which thing, I think most Catholics would not get a passing grade on it.
That's probably a very good point. That's unless someone who's really a scholar of papal writing can tell the two one from the other. Yeah, that's probably a very good point. Let's talk about her a little bit about her, because the 60s and the 70s were not only periods of huge change for the world, for society at large, but for the church itself. I think there's this really interesting encounter she has with the Jesuit priest, Father Daniel Berrigan, who's he and his brother, very famous for their anti-war efforts during the Vietnam conflict. And, so he visits her at this Catholic worker farm in upstate New York, and he's about to celebrate Mass for the community. And he's just wearing his stole. And she says, no, you're not. You're going to put on the proper vestments. And he says, something to the effect of those regulations by the church on what you have to wear at church are stupid. Would Jesus care what I wore? And she probably said something to the effect of, yeah, because Jesus gave the church the ability to make rules about what you wear at church. Go put on your vestments. And he did. That's probably going to surprise a lot of people that she was and I'm only using that as an example of her dedication and fealty to church discipline. So talk a little bit about her experiences in the midst of the Vatican II and post-Vatican II eras, please.
Yeah, and that I think that story, I have a couple stories I'd like to share with you that are along those
Please.
lines. But one is that it pained her very much that not all of the Catholic workers would attend Mass. That was very important to her, you know, being a daily communicant. So it was very painful for her to see that change, you know, because in the early days they all went to Mass together. You know, it's a very liturgical movement. I mean, yeah, Addie Bethune, and you know, it was very liturgically based. And in the 70s, you know, she began to see more and more Catholic workers, not all of them, of course, but some, you know, and that pained her a lot. But the other story that involves Dan Berrigan, you may have heard in a different form, because we finally found out that he was the priest. But there's a story about a young priest who had the precious blood in a coffee cup and offered it to people. And then afterwards, Dorothy takes the coffee cup and digs a hole in the backyard and prays over it and buries it, because she feels like it needs to be brought back into the earth now. You know, it can't just be used as a coffee cup in the
Right.
And there's different variations on that story too. It's sort of like a lot of stories of saints. It starts to get its own legs. There's a version where it's a styrofoam cup. I think styrofoam hadn't been invented at that point, but it's a styrofoam cup and she dug it out of the trash. So there's these different versions of this. There's one where she genuflects in front of the trash can. But we think it was a ceramic cup, and she kind of brought it back to the earth in digging the hole. But for a long time, it wasn't known who the priest was, and it turned out it was Dan Berrigan. It was an eyewitness who explained it. We know that it happened. The part about digging a hole in a ground and burying it, that is still being debated by some people. But we know that she objected to the Mass because she wrote in her column that she's not a big fan of coffee cup masses. And that happened almost it was a week after that incident occurred. So, you know, she was kind of registering her opposition. But what was interesting about how that got resolved was some of the other Catholic workers noticed that Dorothy was upset about this, and they think, okay, how can we do this? Because they asked Dan Berrigan why he doesn't bring a chalice. And in the story that gets passed around, he's doing it for ideological reasons. You know, it's almost like with the stole, you know.
Yeah.
The story is that what he said when asked was that he had lost the chalice in his travel kit, and he just was grabbing whatever he could because he had lost the chalice in his Mass travel kit. So one of the Catholic workers reached out to a liturgical artist who made chalices and got him a chalice and gave it to Dan Berrigan. And Dan Berrigan used that chalice for, you know, many years, maybe to the end of his life, but he loved the chalice and he used that chalice. And there's even a picture of him in a book about the Catholic worker, having Mass at the Catholic worker and using that chalice. So it was a great example of how you can solve a problem that, you know, at the end of the day, you might have figured that it was ideological, but actually he had lost his chalice, you know, and so giving him a new one was a solution. So there were no more coffee cup masses after that.
That's a great solution. You know, give him the means. That's fantastic. Her last official public appearance I've read was at the 1976 Eucharistic Congress in Philadelphia. And she spoke there, and she also, another person who spoke there and actually celebrated Mass was a Polish archbishop named Karol Cardinal Wojtyła.
Sure.
Do we know if they had any interaction? Did they get to meet?
Well, you know, in the sainthood process, it's often referred to documentary record. There is no documentary record of them meeting. However, Mother Teresa, many times they were friends. I think Mother Teresa might have been at that one too. I'm not 100% sure.
Really, wow, that would have been an awesome event to attend. 3 saints and one, or potential saints, and one.
Yeah, I mean, we were kids, you know, in the
Yeah,
bicentennial, but you probably remember it is a big deal,
it was huge.
you know.
It was awesome. I loved it. That was one of my favorite years of my childhood because there was all this red, white, and blue, and they had all these cool logos and symbols. Yeah, it was fantastic. It was a big deal.
I think it was a little bit like the way the year 2000 was celebrated, that the U.S. bishops organized listening sessions with the faithful, where they traveled to different parts of the country, and then they had this big Eucharistic Congress in Philadelphia, of course. And what was interesting about those listening sessions was Dorothy, you know, was one of the people invited to speak to the bishops. Now, this was a kind of, you know, in a church basement type of thing. You know, this was not a big public event. And she sat down and thanked them for all that they do and for their ministry. And afterwards, I know it was a young bishop staff person who ended up having quite a career as a layman in philanthropy. And he told me that afterwards, the bishops were just so buoyed by the experience. And he said she was the only one that didn't yell at them. That the speakers who in these listening sessions told them that they should be doing more of this or more of that. And she thanked them. And she thought that's what they needed right then. And, you know the story of Dorothy Day, people like with, you know, cardinals in New York. I mean, she was not, Cardinal Spellman particularly, you know, she was not shy about when she thought they were straying from, you know, the church's teaching on workers and whatnot. You know, she was not afraid of them. But the fact that she took that opportunity to thank them, I think really said something about her ability to sense what was needed in the moment. And the fact that, you know, the staff person felt like she was the only one who didn't yell at them, that was interesting to me.
It is, and it says a lot about her and about her. You know, she spent 3 hours a day in prayer. I don't know if we mentioned that, but 3 hours a day in prayer. And my sense for my own prayer life, and it's, you know, it's not 3 hours, is that you come to see more clearly what is needed and what God wants for you in your life than doing prayers or things like this. And so for her to have discerned that, it's just fantastic. I really, really appreciate you sharing that with us. Towards the end here, I want to ask you, there was and I think it's a good lead-in maybe to kind of encapsulating or summing up her life. Not that this quote is, but maybe it's a good lead-in, in other words. A Jesuit priest named Daniel Lyons wrote or said that he called her the apostle of pious oversimplification, and that the Catholic worker often distorted beyond recognition the position of the popes, which I think a lot of us as Catholics can say guilty, because, you know, we bring our own kind of ideological bents to it, our hopes, our dreams, our anxieties, these sorts of things. What would you, as kind of, you know, a way into summing up her life and kind of bringing us to the denouement here, what would you say to a statement like that?
I don't quite understand it, but I guess what I would say is that she prayed at the shrine of the Immaculate Conception for a way to take her gifts of writing and being engaged in political movements and to serve God in that way. And and God answered her prayer. God sent somebody, Peter Morin, to be a partner in that. And then she spent the rest of her life living that out, sharing her gifts, being, one of the things about a sainthood cause is if a person's published, I think we talked about this before about the amount of publications. She has 1,450 distinct publications, most of them religious. There's some before her conversion, and there's some gardening columns for the Staten Island Advance, but most of them are religious work. Well over 1,000 different distinct publications. Some of these are articles in her newspaper, and some of these are books. So I look at her life and I look at, did she respond to the call? Did she respond to, what God gave her in response to her prayer? And I think the answer is yes. And as my job is just to collect evidence here at the Dorothy Day Inquiry, and the Congregation for the Causes of Saints will take a look at this and make a decision. Did she live a life of heroic virtue? And I'm the kind of person, I'm more skeptical. So I kind of expected the more I got into this, the less I would believe that to be true. But the more I get into this, the more I believe it to be true.
Yep. No, I agree with you. And, Abraham Lincoln said something that I kind of think brings light to this. In his second inaugural address, he said, with firmness to do the right as God gives us the light to see that right. And that is an important consideration, I think, because we need to, we are not omniscient. We are not infallible. The Pope is only infallible when he speaks on matters of faith and morals, and then and only then in certain circumstances. So even he, so we're all just doing the best we can, I think, and Dorothy, as one of the most compelling examples of sanctity in our time, I think that she does it better than just about it. Let me put it this way, just as well as anyone have ever studied does and has. So good, praise God for her and her life and her being a Catholic and leading us closer to Christ, I would say. Well, thank you everyone for being with us, and thank you, Jeffrey, for sharing your time. I really appreciate it. If you like what you've seen, go ahead and click that little button to subscribe. Be sure to give the thumbs up signal, and follow me on Patreon. Links below, right below there, and we will go from there. Thank you so much, and see you the next time on That Catholic Saints Guy.